Welcome to Lesson 14 of GMAT Math Basics. Today, we're going to discuss dividing and dividing by decimals. So the key question that we're going to answer is, how do you divide decimals, or how do you divide by decimals without a calculator, under time pressure, without making mistakes? See if you can recall how to do this. If you can, you might want to move on to the next lesson. If you can't, let's walk through how to do it together. There are actually many ways to accomplish this objective, but here's what I recommend. Step 1, write the division as a fraction. So put the thing that you're dividing above the fraction bar and put what you're dividing by below the fraction bar. Then, when you've got it set up as a fraction, multiply by 1 until there are no more decimal places. And I know that might sound a little bit weird or like that's not going to do anything, but I promise I will explain later why that is a very good idea. And then the third step is just use long division if you need to after that. So let's try to make sense of those three steps and give you some specific examples. How about we begin with the example 0.04, or 4 hundredths, divided by 0.2, or 2 tenths. Some of you might be able to do this in your head, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just using it as an example to demonstrate the technique. Step 1, write the division as a fraction. On top, we will write 0.04, and on the bottom, we'll write 0.2. Hopefully that step is fairly familiar. If it's not, I've got some recommendations about how to learn the basics of fractions from an earlier lesson in this series. In fact, that is lesson 3. If you're not sure how to set up fractions, that's where I would go right now, and then return to this episode when you've got those fraction basics down. So that's step 1. Let's explore step 2, which is this multiplying by 1 concept. The basic idea is very similar to what we do in order to find a common denominator when we are adding or subtracting fractions. You might recall that this is just multiplying by 1 in a very creative way. If you want a refresher in how to use common denominators, that's actually also in lesson 3 of this series. In this particular case, you'll usually want to use a multiple of 10 on the top and the bottom. Let me just repeat that real quick. Generally, when you're dividing by decimals and you are using this technique that I'm about to show you, where you're first setting it up as a fraction, generally you'll want to use a multiple of 10, such as 10, 100, 1,000, etc., on the top and the bottom of the fraction you are multiplying by. So if I want to multiply by 100, the way to multiply by 1 in a creative way is do 100 over 100. If I want to multiply by 1,000, and I'll tell you how you'll know when to use each one, then I want to multiply by 1,000 over 1,000. So this is a creative way of multiplying by 1. And again, it's very similar to how we used that same concept when we discussed how to find a common denominator between fractions. So why? Why would I want to use a multiple of 10 when I'm dealing with decimal division? It's because multiplying by 10 moves decimal places. And our goal with this technique will be to move all the decimal places so that we are left with only integers in the fraction. That's the goal. Multiplying by 10 helps us do this. Let me give you an example. What's 0.04 times 10? If you're not sure how this works, think about it like a fraction and try to visualize this in your mind if you're just on the pure audio feed here. 0.04 is the same as 4 divided by 100. So if we set that up as a fraction, that's what it's going to look like. And then if you multiply that by 10, hopefully you are already familiar with how that's going to become 4 over 10. If I take 4 over 100 and I multiply by 10, it will become 4 divided by 10. If we write 4 divided by 10 as a decimal, then that would be 0.4. So hopefully you can see how multiplying by 10 takes something that used to be 0.04 and turns it into just 0.4. Again, multiplying by 10 shifts the decimal point to the right 1 place. Now, if you feel confused by that, definitely reach out to us. You can reach us at the GMAT Strategy on current social channels. Feel free to shoot us a DM. And it might be helpful to write it out. If you're in a situation right now where you can't physically write it out, that's fine. You can imagine writing it out. I don't know if that's going to help you in this particular moment. But maybe when you get home from wherever you are right now, if you're on the go, you might want to hit repeat as part of your study session this evening or later today. on this episode and see if you can write out what I'm talking about if you're not really feeling like you get that whole concept of multiplying by 10 shifts the decimal place to the right. We do a quick other example. Let's multiply 0.004 times 100. Again, think about it like a fraction. 4 divided by 100 times 100 yields 4. That's how you could turn 0.04 into 4, the integer, or 4.0 if you prefer. You just multiply it by 100. Or you can think about it as multiplying by 10 twice, which is the same as multiplying by 100, and that shifts the decimal place 2 places to the right. So back to our example, 0.04 divided by 0.2. In these cases, I recommend multiplying by 10 enough times to get rid of all the decimal places. In this case, we have 0.04 on top, that has 2 decimal places, and 0.2 on the bottom, that just has 1 decimal place. So we're going to multiply by 100 over 100. And that's because multiplying by 100 is going to get rid of the 2 decimal places on the top, and that will leave us with only integers in the fraction. If we did that, the way we would write it is 0.04, and then the fraction bar right below that, and then 0.2 right below that, and then times to the right or left, 100, fraction bar below that, 100 right below that. So you're just multiplying by 1 in a very creative way, but if you make that 1 into 100 over 100, it can really help you make this division simpler to think about. We just delete all the decimals by multiplying by 1 enough times, multiplying by 10 over 10 if you want. And that makes it easier to deal with without a calculator for most of us. So if we do that multiplication of 100 over 100 times 0.04 over 0.2, that means we move the decimal place to the right 2 places in both numbers. That would give us 4 on top and then 20 on the bottom. Once again, if you have trouble visualizing this or making sense of it, write it out as a fraction. That should really help. So where are we now? We've got 4 on top. We've got 20 on the bottom of our fraction. And believe it or not, that has the same numerical value as 0.04 on top and 0.2 on the bottom. Which is a little wild the first few times you go through this process to kind of think about the deeper aspects of that. But if that's blowing your mind too much, I would just say leave that for another day and just focus on being able to do it. And sometimes the why is not as important as the what. And I think this is definitely one of those cases if you're just trying to max out your GMAT score and go to B school. If you want to get a PhD in math, though, then there's a lot of mind blowing between now and the end of that journey. So let's reduce the fraction of 4 over 20. If you need help remembering how to reduce fractions, that's in lesson 4 of this Math Basics series. So what number divides 4 and 20? Hopefully you're thinking 4 divides both. So let's write the top of the fraction as 4 times 1 and the bottom of the fraction as 4 times 5. That's the same as 20. And then let's divide out the 4 on the top and bottom, which would leave us with 1 on top and 5 on the bottom, which is the answer to the question, what is 0.04 divided by 0.2? If you want to express that fraction as a decimal, then you can just use long division with decimals, and that's lesson 10 of this series if you want help understanding that better. You can just use long division with decimals to transform 1 over 5 into a decimal again. Sometimes the question on the GMAT will have a fraction in the answers, in which case you're done. Other times it'll have a decimal, and if you go back to lesson 10, I'll walk you through how to make that happen without making mistakes, which is really important. Now, you can also memorize that 1/5 is 0.2. And it's probably a good time to make a little side note. I definitely recommend memorizing your thirds, your fourths, your fifths, your ninths, and your 11ths as decimals. And what I mean by that is memorize 1/3, 2/3, 3/3 as decimals. I mean, 3/3, hopefully you know that's 1.0. But if you didn't, fast tracking you there. Memorize your 1/4 or 1/4. So 1/4 is 0.25. 2/4 is the same as 1/2. That's 0.5. 3/4 is 0.75. And then on for your fifths, your ninths, and your 11ths as well. Sorry, I forgot eighths. I don't know how. That was just a typo, everybody. So let me repeat that. I recommend memorizing your thirds, your fourths, your fifths, your eighths, your ninths, and your 11ths as decimals. They come up a decent amount. Might be worth coming back to this in the future and writing those down. I will put those in the comments section or the show notes. And let me just write myself a quick note to make that happen. And let's get back to our lesson. The reason it's worth memorizing those, in my opinion, is they come up enough and it's useful enough to just have that intuitive understanding that 3/8 and 0.375 are the same thing, because it usually decreases the friction on certain math problems. Now, this is getting a little bit beyond math basics, but it's kind of a convenient time to make that recommendation. And if you're not sure how to memorize those, just make flashcards for each individual one. And if you're not sure how to make flashcards, just hop on to a web search or your preferred search product du jour, as we've got quite a bit of competition in that space, which I think is very interesting these days, and ask the powers that be of that search tool what the different decimal equivalents of these numbers are, and if you need to, how to make flashcards well. If you've never used flashcards before, or you're not sure you're using flashcards before, don't be embarrassed to just look that up and get some support on how to make flashcards. In fact, we should probably do that as a future pod. So sorry for the little side quest there, but I think you'll thank me later when you see 37.5% on test A and you're like, oh, that's 3/8. That's a really, really nice connection to be able to make in the moment. Okay, so back to the lecture at hand. That's the basic technique. Step one, you express the decimals as a fraction. You multiply by 1 until all the decimal places are removed, and then you use long division, if needed, to transfer that fraction back into decimal form. That's it. That's the whole technique. Let's try another example to cement these concepts for you. Let's do 0.007 divided by 0.0003. If you're on audio and you want to have a little anchor for remembering that, that's James Bond on top, 007, 0.007. And it's the number 3 with that number of zeros in front of it before the decimal place. Okay, so 0.0003 is 3 zeros and then the number 3 after it. All right, so James Bond on top, 3 with 3 zeros in front of it on the bottom. So how would you do this? See if you can think through at least some of the steps that we just discussed and remember. Step 1, set it up as a fraction. 0.007 on top, fraction bar beneath that, beneath the fraction bar, 0.0003. Step 2, multiply by 1. In this case, we could multiply by 10 over 10 a few times. That's totally acceptable, by the way. Or you could multiply by 10,000 over 10,000, because the number with the largest number of decimal points is 0.0003. That has 4 decimal places in it. You could also multiply by 10 over 10 4 times in a row. Both are totally fine. Just do whatever makes the most sense to you and works well for you. But I strongly recommend writing that out either way. Either write 10 over 10 4 times or write 10,000 over 10,000 down on your scrap paper, because almost nothing is worse than knowing how to do a problem and then missing it because you simply didn't write down what you should have written down and what professionals with your best interests at heart told you to write down. Like that's a moment that you should not tolerate with yourself. You want to become a very good friend to yourself in that moment and say, listen, self, it's time for you and I to have an important and mutually supportive discussion. All right, so we got 3 decimal places on top, but 4 decimal places on the bottom. And if you're unsure about what I mean when I say decimal places are just numbers of digits to the right of the decimal point. So if I have 4 numbers to the right of the decimal point, then that will be a number with 4 decimal places. That's what I'm talking about there. So to get rid of all the decimal places, we will multiply that number by a number that has 4 zeros after it. So you generally want to multiply by a number that has as many zeros as decimal places. A nice shorthand way to know what's best to multiply on top and bottom is just memorize that, take the number with the most decimal places, multiply by a number with that many zeros at the end. For example, if we multiply 0.007 over 0.0003 times 10,000 over 10,000, which is 1 with 4 zeros after it, then we will eliminate all the decimal places in the original fraction. On top, we're going to shift the decimal point 4 places to the right, and that will yield 70. So if we start with 0.007, we shift the decimal place over to the right 1 place, we'll get 0.07. Shift it again to the right, we'll get 0.7. Shift it again to the right, we'll get 7.0. Shift it again to the right a 4th time, we'll get 70.0. which is the same as 70. Again, if you're not sure how that's functioning or you are struggling to grasp that intuitively, just write it as a fraction. When you have a moment to write it down, it would be 7 over 1,000 times 10,000. If you run that kind of example enough times, it should start to make intuitive sense how that works. For 0.0003, shifting the decimal place 4 places to the right just yields 3. So on top, we would have 70, and on the bottom, we would have 3. Once again, sometimes the answer is expressed as a fraction, and in that case, we're done. Pick the right answer and move on. Other times, if it's expressed as a decimal, we just use long division to get the decimal equivalent of 70 over 3. I'm not going to walk through that here because I already walked through it in extraordinary detail in lesson 10. And if you want more help understanding that, highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode or watch it if you're on YouTube. So that's it. That is it. If you apply this well, you should have no trouble dividing decimals or dividing by decimals under time pressure on the exam. If you want more practice, like I have in the past weeks, I recommend you prompt your preferred generative AI model to give you 10 or 100 or 1,000 if you want decimal division problems. That will help you increase your GMAT score. Most Gen AI tools are going to understand what the GMAT is and be able to tailor their problems to that specific situation. Then you can always ask that model to explain the problems to you if you don't understand them. Currently, in my personal opinion, and this is just my subjective opinion, ChatGPT does the best job of this, but others are comparable. So if you like other brands or other models, that's completely fine. And I have yet to find a model that does a terrible job with this. And if I do, I'll let you know. In the meantime, if you're stuck or if you have questions on any of this, just shoot us a DM, like I said, at the GMAT strategy on current social channels, and we will do our worldly best to help you out. As always, my greatest hope is that this material will make your studies as easy and as painless as they can possibly be. If you want more tips and strategies for optimizing your performance on the GMAT, please head to our website, thegmatstrategy.com, which is linked in the description of this content if you want to click it. And check out our free video on how to achieve your dream GMAT score in half the normal time. Going to save you a ton of time with the information in that video. In the meantime, this is a weekly show, so please subscribe and stay positive and stay consistent with your studies. Talk to you all soon.